with PowerPoint.
Thank you, Eduard. Thank you for your nice introduction, and it's very nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I work on Middle East politics and Turkish foreign policy, and as Eduard says, Turkey is now center of attention. Unfortunately, it's not for some good reasons. I mean, the news from the region, including Turkey, is a bit depressing. And it's also quite challenging to make sense of, what is going on. It is difficult to be a scholar and academic nowadays because, especially if you are trying to understand and explain the current politics, it's quite challenging because by the time you finish writing something, things move on the ground pretty quickly. So it is really challenging times. Today, I will talk about Turkey, but in a larger context of regional powers in the Middle East. First, I will talk about the issue of regional powers in the Middle East and make some generalizations about regional powers in this region. And then talk about different dynamics for regional powers in certain turning points, like the Gulf War of 1990-1991 being the first turning point in the post-Cold War era, and then 2003, Iraq War, another turning point, and the Arab uprisings, another turning point, and now with the rise of ISIS, with a question mark whether we are in yet another turning point in terms of regional powers. So I will discuss regional powers through these different periods. I'm not going to go into details, but of course the concept of regional powers is a difficult one because it consists of two contested concepts. Region, what is a region is always a contested subject, particularly in the Middle East because it does not refer to a clear geography. The concept of power is also a highly contested concept. Without going into details of that, I will just try to define regional powers as it appears in the literature. What makes a country a regional power. And I will talk about four aspects. There has to be a claim to leadership. So that state, a regional power, should have a claim to leadership. The second characteristic of a regional power is that there has to be possession of necessary resources. And here we talk about military capabilities, but also economic power, demography, geographical position of a country, and also soft power capabilities. That is the attraction of that country has in that region. So not only claim to leadership is necessary, but that country should have necessary power resources to be a regional power. It also has to have necessary foreign policy instruments to be a regional power. And lastly, but also very important, I think, there should be acceptance of the leadership role by the third parties in the region. This is generally Israel is given as an example to this. Although Israel has the power capabilities, particularly economic power, military power, but it does not have acceptance in the region. This is also an important element of being a regional power. So when I refer to regional powers, please think these different aspects of regional powers. When we look at the Middle East from that perspective, we realize that Middle East has several characteristics in terms of regional powers. One is that there are several regional powers in the Middle East, not one, but several. namely Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, and Israel are generally considered as regional powers, and they compete for power and influence. None of these powers are hegemonic. In other words, none of them has the leadership role, except for brief periods. I mean, you may say that Egypt had a leadership role in the 50s and in the 60s, till mid-60s. But this is really exceptional. When you look at the modern history of the Middle East, generally you see regional powers competing with each other. This is the case because none of the regional powers has all the capabilities of a regional power. They are good in one, but not the other. For instance, Saudi Arabia has enormous economic capabilities, but not necessarily enough military capabilities and demography and so on. So each regional power lack in some of the aspects of regional powership. And therefore, rather than having one dominant regional power, we have several regional powers competing for power and influence in the region, and no hegemonic power, regional power, except for short periods. There's an intense competition between these regional powers. They try to protect their status, or even better, enhance their power vis-à-vis others, and also they prevent any other regional power to become a hegemonic power. So even if they cannot be the dominant regional power, they don't want others to be the dominant regional power. This is, for instance, very typical between Iran and Turkey, two important regional powers. And while they're trying to enhance their own powers, they also prevent each other to become the dominant regional power. Another characteristic of the region is the importance of the U.S. as the extra-regional power. The presence of the U.S. Affects the competition among regional powers because the U.S. Is even sometimes acts as a regional power itself, especially after, for instance, the invasion of Iraq. The U.S. became part of the regional power struggle. But the Middle East is a highly penetrated region. External powers are very much interested in the Middle East. Particularly, the U.S. has been the most dominant power, extra-regional power, since the end of World War II. And the presence and activism of the U.S. in the region affects regional powers and the struggle between them. And we will see this when we discuss different eras of Middle East history. The U.S. is influential, not only affecting regional powers' competition, but also U.S. tries to prevent any one of the regional power to dominate the region. This is true for countries that U.S. does not have good relations with. For instance, Iran, the U.S. does not want Iran to be the dominant regional power. But this is even true for countries that U.S. is allies with, like Turkey, for instance. Because if the region is dominated by one regional power, that in a way limits U.S. room for maneuver in the region. So therefore, the U.S. factor has to be taken into consideration. Also other extra-regional powers, but I underline particularly the U.S. because of its importance for regional politics. Another characteristic of the region is the fluidity of the boundaries. It's hard to define the Middle East. Is there a Middle East? If so, where is it? The boundaries are quite fluid, and this affects regional power competition. And clearly, here we have an Arab core, including two contenders of regional hegemony, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, but then secondary Arab powers as well. They constitute the bulk of the region. And then you have three countries also contenders for regional leadership, but their regional identities are contested. Eduard also referred to this in the case of Turkey. I mean, whether Turkey is a Middle Eastern power or not, clearly Turkey has several regional identities, and its identity as a Middle Eastern power is contested. Recently, with several colleagues, we came up with a concept for these states. We call them cusp states, which means that these states are in the border. They don't fit neatly in any region, both in terms of their identities and in terms of their activities. And this was a study where we looked at several cusp states in the world, actually, not only in the Middle East. For instance, our cases include Mexico, Brazil, Taiwan, Ukraine, but we had 3 cases from the Middle East as well, and these happen to be the contenders for regional leadership: Turkey, Iran, and Israel. These are from the region, but also not from the region. So they have this cusp status. They are in between. And so this is an interesting, peculiar feature of Turkey's, of Middle East regional power competition, because 3 of the contenders are cusp states. They do not neatly fit into the Middle East. They're part of the Middle East, but also they are not part of the core of the Middle East. Another characteristic of Middle East in terms of regional power competition is the presence of regionally influential non-state actors, quote-unquote non-state actors. These limit the influence of the regional powers. Of course, many examples can come to mind. We can even go back to the PLO, for instance, acting as an actor, regional actor, limiting regional powers' influence, for instance, Egypt's influence. But in recent years, we refer to Hezbollah or Hamas or Kurdish groups, several Kurdish groups, and now ISIS or Islamic State. Although it calls itself a state, we can still consider it a non-state actor. And all these actors becoming regionally influential, limiting regional powers' influence, when you think of them. Okay. Another characteristic of this region is that there are ideologies and ideational issues that resonate regionally, and they're also widely used in competition among regional powers. It could be Arab nationalism, to use to enhance the power of regional powers or limit them. For instance, Arab nationalism was used by Nasser to enhance Egypt's regional power status, whereas the same Arab nationalism limited Saudi Arabia's influence in the region during the Cold War years. Or you can talk about sectarianism today in the Middle East, the conflict between Shiites and Sunnis used by regional powers to limit each other's. For instance, and I will refer to this when we discuss the post-Arab Spring era, Turkey's influence was limited when Turkey was put in this box as a Sunni power. If you frame Turkey as a Sunni power, you are limiting Turkey's influence to only part of the Middle East. Or similarly, Iran's influence was limited by use of sectarianism, Shiaism, and by framing Iran as a Shiite state. So all these ideologies are important in this competition among regional powers. And finally, characteristic of this region is that there are no effective regional institutions, organizations that can mitigate this conflict among regional powers. You have the Arab League or the GCC. First of all, they're not very effective as regional organizations. Maybe GCC a bit more than the Arab League, but still, not so much effective. But more importantly, they are not all the members of the region are members of these organizations. GCC is limited to the Gulf. Even important Gulf states are not members of the GCC, like Iran and Iraq. And Arab League is only limited to the Arab world. This means that there is an intense competition among regional powers, and there is no regional organization, no possibilities of turning this competition into a cooperation among regional powers. So this creates further problems. Okay, now let's look at how regional powers have fared throughout the recent history, particularly since the end of the Cold War. As I said, I will divide this period into different sub-periods where you had an important event that created both opportunities and challenges for the regional powers. So an important regional event occurs, and the regional powers see both opportunities and challenges in this event and try to keep their powers or enhance their powers. Therefore, the competition intensifies because of that. And one such moment was the Gulf War, 1990-1991 Gulf War. It was an important regional event. Of course, it was about Iraq and Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, but it had regional repercussions, and the regional powers perceived opportunities and threats in this new environment, and they tried to position themselves accordingly. When I look at this era, what I see is basically the dominance of the United States in regional politics. This was not because of only the U.S. Forces defeating Iraq, but also because of the general power configuration in the international system. Because, as you may remember, this was called the unipolar moment of the United States. The Cold War was over, U.S. emerged as the dominant power. It had implications for the Middle East. It defeated, with a coalition, Iraq, and imposed a new regime on Iraq. So therefore, clearly this was the moment of the U.S. in the Middle East as well. It started a peace process. It started to implement dual containment policy. This was a period where the U.S. was really dominant in regional politics. In addition to that, especially Arab countries, and here 3 Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Syria, facing this new environment, try to enhance the power of the Arab countries and try to develop a new regional order. And they came up with Damascus Declaration in March 1991 and tried to create a new order and put themselves at the center of that order. But when you look at the actual implementation of the Damascus Declaration, you see that they also, especially the Gulf states, continued to rely on the United States. So this was a regional order where the U.S. was dominant, coordinating with 3 Arab states mainly, engaging in a peace process, Arab-Israeli peace process, containing Iran and Iraq. This was the regional order. But what happened during this period was also the increasing inclusion of non-Arab regional powers into regional politics. What I mean by that is that there was a normalization between Arab countries and Israel to some extent because of the peace process. So Israel was to some extent included in regional politics. Even Iran was included in regional politics to some extent because its relations with Saudi Arabia especially began to improve during this period. But these were very limited. Why? With Israel, there was still no peace treaty, so its inclusion was limited. With Iran, its inclusion was still limited because of the U.S. policy of dual containment, which also contained Iran. What about Turkey? Turkey was the least included, I would argue, during this period, regional power, because unlike Israel and Iran, its relations with its main Arab protagonist, which was Syria, was very problematic. So Syria, in a way, vetoed Turkey's inclusion into the new Middle East order. You may remember at that time Turkish-Syrian relations were very problematic, and the two countries almost went to war in 1998 because of the PKK and water issue. I mean, we may go into details if there are questions. But this was the regional order, so it looked like two Arab states, especially Saudi Arabia and Egypt, regional powers were gaining influence. A secondary power, Syria, was also becoming active, but this was all happening under the umbrella of a U.S.-led regional order. Damascus Declaration, although not as effective, was important for Egypt because it meant the return of Egypt into regional politics after isolated because of Camp David for a long time. This was important for Saudi Arabia to establish a regional order. For Syria, it was important because it wanted to engage with the United States in the post-Cold War era. So it was to enhance their influence under the U.S. leadership. And that's how the regional politics was ordered in the 1990s. As I said, Turkey was less included. Iran and Israel's engagements were there, but they were limited. Okay, the next period, another important event that created new opportunities and challenges for the regional powers was the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. This was really, in terms of the U.S., of course, this was the highest point of unilateral interventionism by the U.S. Yet, ironically, looking back, you can see that this was also the period where the U.S. influence in the region began to decline. And the U.S. efforts to create a new order in the 2000s were met by resistance and led to unintended consequences. It is interesting, U.S. was challenged in Iraq. U.S. was challenged by the election of Hamas. U.S. was challenged by the rise of Hezbollah in Lebanon. U.S. was challenged by Iran, clearly. And even U.S.'s allies like Turkey were also trying to limit U.S.'s influence. For instance, I would argue that Turkey was soft balancing the U.S. in the 2000s by engaging Syria, because U.S. government was critical of Turkey's relations with Syria, whereas Turkey continued to develop its relations with Syria during this period. Similarly, Saudi Arabia was not happy, Egypt was not happy about Bush administration's policy of democratization, for instance, and they were trying to balance United States. So after a high point with the invasion of Iraq, this period witnessed declining U.S. influence in the region. And this vacuum was filled by particularly non-Arab regional powers, and I would say Iran and Turkey. What about the Arab world? The Arab world was divided. And that's why many scholars call this regional Cold War. There were two groups, basically. On the one hand, Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, and Hamas, that were trying to limit U.S. influence and U.S. allies' influence in the region. And then you had, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and, on the other side. Turkey was trying to remain above these regional divisions. This regional Cold War turned into hot wars in different instances, like Lebanon War or in Gaza War. So it was basically regional powers, again, vying for influence in the vacuum created by declining U.S. influence. This period was characterized, as I said, by rising influence of non-Arab regional powers in particular. Israel had still limited influence, but it had a tacit alliance with major Arab states against Iran. Iran's influence was rising, clearly. It was also becoming popular after the Lebanese war, I'm sorry. Iran was influential in Iraq, had good relations with Syria. So Iran was no longer only influential in the Gulf anymore, but with the toppling of the Saddam regime, it had become a Mediterranean power because of the link to Syria, Hamas, and Hezbollah. So clearly this was an era where Iran's influence was rising. The other important regional power that was rising its influence was Turkey. I mean, this was really the moment. Two colleagues of mine called this period Ankara moment in the Middle East. Really, Turkey was quite influential in the Middle East during this period. Why? Because it remained above conflicts. It was playing this role of a mediator in regional conflicts. It was talking to everybody and trying to solve conflicts in the region. It was engaging the region economically. Its economic relations with the Middle East were booming. At the same time, it was welcomed in the region. Some countries welcomed Turkey, like Saudi Arabia, because they wanted an actor to balance Iran, now that the United States was not so much engaged in the region. Turkey was popular with what we call the Arab Street. It was a shining model, in a way, quote unquote. It was successful politically. It was democratizing. Its relations with the EU were developing. In 2004, it's hard to remember now, but the accession negotiations had started. Its economy was booming. So basically, it had the soft power, and it had the acceptance from the region. And basically, it was a rising regional power during this period. Okay, what about the next period after the Arab uprisings? Well, the situation again changed. Again, Arab uprisings provided opportunities and challenges to regional powers, and they tried to keep their power, or better yet, enhance their power. One development, as far as the U.S. was concerned this time, I mean, I told you that after 2003, U.S. influence was in decline and U.S. acceptance was declining. But after the Arab uprisings, the perception in the region was that U.S. was somehow disengaging from the region. How did they get this perception? Well, Obama administration clearly announced that they would not be continuing interventionist policies of the Bush administration. They would not be continuing this democratization agenda of the Bush administration. They are going to withdraw from Iraq. That's what they announced. When uprisings occurred in Egypt, they basically allowed, Mubarak to go, which alarmed U.S. allies in the region, especially in the Gulf, because they realized that they are maybe on their own if something happens in their countries as well. So basically, the regional powers realized that, at least perceived that the U.S. was disengaging from the region. Also, despite the calls from the regional powers, including Turkey, but also the Gulf states, U.S. refused to intervene in Syria. All this signaled to the regional powers that U.S. is maybe disengaging from the region. So the perception was that they're on their own, they should compete with each other and turn the Arab uprising to their advantage. So this perception of disengagement of the U.S. Further intensified the competition among regional powers. But what happened to them, whether they gained or lose as a result of the Arab uprising? By the end of 2013, when you look at the regional powers, it looked like they had mixed results. They gained some, but also lost. Okay, let's look at the regional powers one by one. Eduard, if you may. Okay, let's look at Turkey. Of course, when the Arab uprising started, it looked like Turkey was going to gain from this. I mean, I remember going to several meetings. I'm sure we have been together in some of them. Everybody was saying that Turkey is the winner of this.
The new Mecca.
The new Mecca. Turkey will win because of the Arab uprisings, because after all, Turkey was the most popular with the people. And who was going to come to power as a result of elections? Muslim Brotherhood in most countries, and the AKP government had good relations with the Muslim Brotherhood movements, and they can influence them. So this was going to work for Turkey. But the opposite happened. I would argue that Turkey was maybe the most important loser as a result of the Arab uprisings. First of all, Syria and the developments in Syria basically proved that Turkey had no leverage over Syria as it claimed it had before. And Turkey tried to topple the Assad regime after trying to convince Assad initially to start reforms. But when that failed, Turkey actively adopted the strategy of regime change in Syria. And that policy has failed, as you know. Assad is still in power, and Turkey's relations with Syria are really in crisis. And now the Syrian crisis has spilled over into Turkey in a way. How? There are more than 200,000, there are about 2 million Syrian refugees in Turkey today. Only 200,000 of them are in camps. The others are scattered throughout Turkey. This is creating social tensions, economic hardship, and these people are there to stay. All the studies show that most of them will not, they do not want to go back even if the civil war in Syria ends. This is a strain on the social system, on the schooling system. So this is a big crisis for Turkey, the refugee issue. There has already been also bombings in different parts of Turkey. There was a big bombing in Reyhanlı where many people were killed. Now the Kurdish issue is spilling over into Turkey again. We may talk about this in more detail in the Q&A session. So basically, Syria is a mess, and it's affecting Turkey negatively. And Turkey by itself cannot really change things on the ground in Syria. And it tries to convince its allies that, Assad should go. So, and now Iraq is also increasingly in a mess, another Middle Eastern neighbor. So Turkey faces this enormous instability in its southern border with very little tools to effect change in neither Syria nor Iraq. In addition to that, in Egypt, Turkey's influence also basically ended. Turkey actively supported the Morsi administration, but when there was a coup d'etat that toppled that administration, Turkey was openly very critical of that coup, and basically called on the regime to release Morsi, and as a result, Turkey's relations with Egypt have deteriorated. I mean, a few years ago they were talking about a strategic partnership, but now there is no relationship between Turkey and Egypt. Turkey's relations with central administration in Iraq are quite problematic. Turkey, although it tries to better its relations with Iran, they have an opposite position in Syria. So basically, Turkey's Middle East policy is in shambles. I mean, there are, just to give you an example, there are no Turkish ambassadors in Egypt, in Israel, and in Syria. 3 important regional capitals, there are no Turkish ambassadors. Turkish soft power has no longer there. The new polls show that Erdogan's popularity is in decline. Turkey's popularity is in decline. This is in sharp contrast with the polls a few years ago, where Turkey was very popular and Erdogan was very popular. Turkey was boxed into this Sunni power framework, which further limits Turkey's influence. And Turkey is basically in isolation in the Middle East. So in the post-Arab uprising era, one of the regional powers, Turkey has lost a lot of its influence in the region. What about Iran? It's more of a mixed bag for Iran. There are limitations. Iran could not do much when Bahraini uprising was suppressed by Saudi Arabia and other GCC states. Iran had more opportunities with Morsi and with Egypt because Mubarak was really anti-Iran. But after the coup, that also is not that significant. There is some success for Iran. At least it prevented Assad from failing, and it became a very important actor in that. But even there are limitations for Iran as well, because, first of all, because of its support of Assad, Iran's soft power in the Middle East has declined tremendously. But more importantly, it is becoming increasingly difficult for Iran to sustain its support for Assad. It has become very costly militarily and financially for Iran. And particularly in a country where Assad has rather limited power base, because Assad regime does not even control all of Syria. To what extent Iran can continue with this policy is a question mark. And furthermore, Iraq is much more important for Iran, and there are also serious challenges for stability in Iraq as well. And in 2 important countries for Iran, in Iraq and Syria, there are enormous instabilities. In Lebanon, Hezbollah's influence is more contested now because it is now involved in the Syrian war. So that also affects Iran's influence. So clearly, for Iran also, there are, compared to the previous period, there are significant challenges in the region. Okay, what about Saudi Arabia, another important regional power? Well, up until recently, it looked like Saudi Arabia, it also lost some, but it was doing much better than the other 2 regional powers because it was more effective in some areas. It controlled the developments in Egypt. It is supporting the Sisi regime, and especially financially, and it controlled the developments in Yemen, and basically started a controlled transition in Yemen. It suppressed the uprising in Bahrain. So by the end of 2013, it looked like it was controlling this wave of uprisings or people's power, which was challenging for Saudi Arabia. It has been working with UAE closely, and these two countries were basically using money and military forces to control the region and to prevent the spreading of the uprisings. But for Saudi Arabia also, there are limitations. It failed to topple Assad. It was a big opportunity for Saudi Arabia to limit Iran's influence. But on the contrary, Iran has become more influential in Syria, and this is something that is challenging for Saudi Arabia. And Egypt and Yemen, Saudi Arabia controlled these two countries, but the situation in these countries are also precarious. Yemen, clearly, with all the divisions, but also in Egypt, especially with what's going on in neighboring Libya, there could be a need for more intervention by Saudis and UAE, by the Emiratis there as well. So basically, in the post-Arab uprising era, all the regional powers lost considerably, although Saudi Arabia seemed to fare better than others. Okay, what about now with the rise of the Islamic State or ISIS? I mean, are we now entering into a new era like others, and how regional powers fare in this new era? This is different because the question here is this a different challenge than the previous challenges? I think to some extent it is. Notwithstanding the fact that this is a really barbaric organization, very radical, and challenging the status quo, it is also different from other transnational non-state actors because it does not have a state patron, whereas other non-state actors, they always had a state patron. I don't mean to say that their state patrons completely controlled them. Not necessarily. It's generally a more complex relationship, but they had, they had at least some ties to a state, whereas here we don't see that. This is really an actor that is acting by itself, and it is challenging the San Remo boundaries of the Middle East, basically, by combining chunks of territory from Syria and Iran. But at the same time, it provides some opportunity for regional countries, and that is that it provides a common threat to them, right? It brings together Saudi Arabia and Iran, two protagonists. They are both against ISIS. It brings together even Hamas with other countries that are normally critical of Hamas, because ISIS is anti-Hamas as well. So, here is a common enemy for all regional actors, including regional powers, with which they can fight with and with which, they can form an alliance against. And it also engages the U.S. in the region, because we talked about U.S. disengagement. It was never a disengagement, in fact. The Obama doctrine, in a way, called on for U.S. engagement, especially against such terrorist challenges. So the U.S. is ready to engage, and in fact, the Riyadh conference, tried to establish such an alliance between the U.S. and regional powers. However, there are still serious problems of cooperation, because regional powers and regional actors, and also extra-regional actors like the United States, are still acting in zero-sum mentality, and they are trying to limit each other, and they are trying to prevent any power to benefit from this coalition. So therefore, they are locked in this problem of cooperation, which may mean that they may fail to defeat ISIS, which is a threat to all of them. Turkey's position is a very clear example. Turkey feels threatened by ISIS and wants to limit ISIS, but at the same time, it has other agendas that it's trying to pursue. One is that it wants to turn this into an opportunity to topple Assad, so therefore trying to negotiate with the United States that this cannot be just limited to defeating ISIS, but it should also expand to topple Assad. The argument here is that there is ISIS because of Assad regime, so if Assad regime is there, you may defeat ISIS, but somebody else, another radical organization can emerge. And also the argument is that what happens if ISIS is defeated? Who is going to fill that vacuum? And Turkey does not want Syrian regime to fill that vacuum. So it's trying to impose its own agenda of toppling Assad. On the other hand, it has concerns about PKK and PYD, its sister organization, to have an autonomy in Syria. So it's trying to prevent that as well. So it has not only this agenda about ISIS, but it has other agendas that it wants to pursue. And by doing so, it's weakening the anti-ISIS coalition because it's dragging its feet. It's true for other countries as well. I mean, Iran is happy about anti-ISIS coalition, but it's not happy about the fact that it's not part of it, right? And it's not happy about the possibility of anti-ISIS coalition can turn into an anti-Assad coalition as well, and that Iran is left out in a settlement in Syria. So, I mean, again, we see the same competition among regional actors and regional powers, which I would argue may mean that the opportunity to act as together against a common threat, which is a common threat to all of them, may be lost. And we may end up with the continuation of instability in both Iraq and Syria. And I will end I'm sorry, with a pessimist note, but that's how it looks from my perspective. Thank you.